that moved outside of an actual issue that relates to being effective. And I just want to know what you think about um, how effective people are. And based on the conversation that we had, what do you think people miss as it relates to being able to use the past and navigating the current?
Americans are feeling like when it comes to politics, like a lot of folks are feeling like drained. A lot of folks are feeling like um, they can't come into spaces and have like their own like thoughts and outlooks on things. A lot of folks feel like they got to be picking a party, right? So it's a little too much like performative politics going on. It's a little too much of a overemphasis on talking points, and it's like we're moving away from actually getting substantial things done for the people. And I feel like that's just the point, what folks are looking for, right? They're looking at it like in a more pragmatic sense, like, yo, who is able like to get things done? And then regardless of what, you got certain politicians where, and not even just politicians, community leaders,
Mm.
leaders in the education, corporate leaders, right? People who are in very important leadership positions and people who have an impact in a lot of lives. Um, for the most part, like some of those people who a lot of the public may not be fond of, they still have support, right? And like love from like the actual supporters and constituents, because they're able to get things done for them, right? They're able to actually bring results. So it's very important, right? Because even me just watching a documentary, about like the effectiveness, um, a big reason why they even chose George Washington, right? To lead the army and to be like, pretty much like leading the charge for the revolution is because of his effectiveness, right? Things that he was able to do in the past. So it's kind of interesting, bro, because I feel like some people who a lot of people are not fond of, they don't
Hmm.
really ask themselves like, yo, why do these particular people still get, support, and why are they still in office? They just think it's, money, money, money. But like, no, they still have to get voted for though. Like, they still have to go through that political process. So they're doing something for somebody.
Yeah, and I think it's super important too when we talk about how people resist and how people navigate these campaigns. I think one of the important pieces around Mamdani, and here we now have probably a candidate in Janice Lewis George who's probably going to run a Mamdani style campaign. I think what happens is, and this is no specificity to her or him. But I think when we have this discussion around the ethos, because the bringing the documentary into appropriate context is you see the formation of a country and you see how when we talk about America and when we talk about how these different pieces come together, America in itself is a very uh, far right country, far right nation. When we talk about how it was formed and the political ideology that it comes under and is undergirded by. And I think that's very important to point out to people because a lot of people, when they have these discussions and when they are moving and navigating in these political spaces, they make the misstep to misassign. And what I mean by misassigning is that you'll hear people say, well, this person is socialist, this person is far left, far right, etc. And so, like, again, even taking it away from a Mamdani and a Janice Lewis George, who are current, if we even look at AOC as a case study, right? In the appropriate context, AOC would not be considered a far left candidate, especially how she governs, because how a person campaign, and I really wish we can get into a space where we differentiate between how people campaign and how people govern. But AOC governs what would be considered a centrist, for lack of a better word, because her rhetoric and a lot of these people rhetoric may be that of the far left, but when it comes to how they implement and how they navigate, they attach themselves to bodies that continuously pull them right because the magnetic nature of what one would call the American ethos, evangelicalism, everything that we're seeing right now in quote unquote Donald Trump and the far right or what MAGA or whatever you want to classify them as, we have to understand that though, to keep it in context of the documentary, that is America. That is what and how we have moved and navigated from. So it's just even always interesting to hear how people talk about, Donald Trump being this anomaly and how all of these people, like the Elizabeth Warrens of the world, are these quote unquote people who are coming to save us. Even like Bernie Sanders. You know me, I say all of the time. I typically appreciate some of his policy positions, but I don't believe any of them are strong enough to be in the political landscape because they are not strong enough to push forward the actual things that they say that they believe in. Because it's one thing to believe in them, it's one thing to it's another thing to actually put forth that and align yourself in those values and allow yourself to become, in a lot of cases, an enemy, right? Because you are going to create enemies in doing that, but I don't think a lot of them would have been able to navigate a space that is the American Revolution. Because I think also the point that we touched on was a very important one, is that these people that you're going up against, and why I've always been against pragmatism in the current way that people operate and navigate in it, is that the colonies of America were afraid, or I wouldn't even say they were afraid, because it took a lot of courage and it took a lot of bravery to go up at what was at the time the behemoth of the British Empire. And so there wasn't really, in my opinion, any pragmatism in that, because you go into that thinking that you're going to lose. Nobody in that moment in time is going into that fight thinking that they're going to beat the British Empire in that way. But you do it anyway because you're fighting for something that you feel like, whether, a person want to argue whether it's wrong or right, you feel like what you're fighting for is the right thing. I don't think any of these people that we have in the current context, in the current political ecosystem, are willing to go that far.
Yeah, I don't
I
think
don't
we
think
are
we are.
either. And it's a big talk up here about the privatizing public housing, right? So if one was to support privatizing all of public housing, right? What as far as that policy, what lane would you kind of consider that would fall under? As far as
So
like
Like
political ideology
ideology.
and whatnot.
for the housing component,
Yeah.
so privatizing housing, I wouldn't necessarily. I would put it in more of a conservative bucket. And I usually put most things that involve privatization in a conservative bucket, mainly for the reason that it is usually going to be centralized as a result thereof. And I think it is basically putting it into the hands of corporations. And for me, once you move anything into that spectrum or that landscape, I think it becomes a conservative tool of sorts. Because for me, I focus and try to focus more on the mechanics and how people weaponize particular industries or particular assets. And so that's, for me, how and why I would put it in being more of a conservative policy to privatize it. Now, on the flip side of that, what I've also heard, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is the Mamdani approach is to uh, uh, put it and move it off of the block of a consumer good and make it so that it is a benefit that is distributed by the government or by NGOs, which are non-government organizations that kind of operate and help government meet its mission statements in a large, uh, weird kind of way, but they act as different arms of the government in that way. And so I think that's what I heard on the flip side of it, and I would say that's the counter and the direct.
In that space, more of like the socialist space, the liberal space, who actually um are supportive privatization of public houses. Back when you were saying how it's one way that somebody campaigns as opposed to the way in which like the policies in which they implement when they in office, or not even just how they campaign, the with like particular talking points they use, and but like the way ALC, like how you said, but when it comes to our policies, it's more like centrist. And I'm like, wow, you got me thinking about like I feel like that's a lot more common than I even thought, right? For you bringing up that point, because of like there's a lot of people say that they are full on a certain, like political, group and whatnot. But I'm like, yo, you don't really hear some of the things that you say in support aligns more with people that you swear are just like terrible when they harm, messing up politics in our society. This is why even when he met Trump, like we actually agree on a lot of things. Trump like really said that. So that's why I still just feel like it's just an overemphasis on talking points. It's an overemphasis on, oh, I'm this, liberal this, conservative this, minor, yada, yada. When a lot of times, like you actually talk to folks, we actually like do agree on more things than like would actually expect. And I actually had this conversation with somebody about this on Friday.
It's heavily prevalent in most places, especially now because we live in a society that is highly polarized. But to move the conversation forward, to your point, so we got merchants, landowners, and then in this whole spectrum right now, as debt continues to accumulate amongst the quote unquote, I would say lower classes, because I don't really believe that we have a middle class right now. Um, the people who paid in blood versus who collect afterward, and how economic warfare, not just liberty, fueled revolt. And I want to move into that part of the discussion as it relates to the documentary as well, because I think you bringing up Mamdani, the policies, the housing issue being one example, but this anti-elitism, movement that quietly rebuilds elites or new elites. Because as we know, um, we have a lot of these anti-elite movements. And like I said, you got the AOCs, you got the Bernie Sanders, you got the Mondanis, you got, even for what it's worth, the Barack Obamas of the world, and a lot of different people in that liberal landscape who are quote unquote anti-elite, but end up, if not coming from elitism themselves, are essentially striving to be elite, right?
Yeah.
And I think it was very important, and I want to again bring it and wrap it back around to the documentary in terms of how do we use the past to inform our future movements? Because when you look at the foundation of America, and when you look at the inaugural pieces, when you look at the founding fathers and everything that they did, right? And I have my critiques of them. And for what it's worth, if we take it at face value, the machine that they intended to build was a machine that did not operate like the monarchy and the tyranny that they fled from, right? Well, not fled, but that's a different conversation for another day. But essentially, and this is why it matters in the documentary, they recreated, or time itself repositioned, what was supposed to be something new and something novel into a place, into a position that begins to look more like an extension of the British Empire itself, right? The same empire in which they fought to detach themselves from. And I think it's important that we look at the ways in which we move and navigate these spaces, because our intentions can be very, very well. Because I'm not here to say who intends to do what. I don't know. I can only go off based on what it is, especially for politicians and people in the business space, what you do, what you set out forth as your missions, and the outcomes, and even more important, the outcomes that you perpetuate. Because you can have an outcome, and I can say, all right, you know what? A person might not have intended that outcome. Intention was to do one thing, but they tried something, right? But when you take said outcome, weaponize it, retool it, to refuel it, to push it, then I must say to myself that this is something that you value and that you stand for and that you believe in and that you want to perpetuate. If that's not true, then I think you should move differently. But why I think it's important now is that we have people, not just in the political space, but the mass as a whole. Again, when we talk about the merchants, when we talk about the landowners, I've been up here, I've talked about the gig economy. I've talked about, again, we end up in a space where housing is unaffordable, especially where you at. We are in this space where people are kind of going along to get along, but the going along to get along is creating and putting everybody in a position that is even more problematic and even worse. And I just want to know your thoughts on that as it relates and how those parallels kind of align themselves. Consider the mercenary class, the service class, the class who aren't necessarily the leaders, but those who are what people would refer to as the bourgeoisies.
Absolutely.
They serve as power. And not to interrupt your point, right? But what do you think about, and I want to bring it back up to the current for people, right? Because it's an important point that you're talking about, and this is the thing that in class warfare that I don't think a lot of people really pay attention to. And so we have the Target boycott. We've had the movements, Black Lives Matter. We've had, what was that? The Wall Street movement. I forget. It's been so many, but that was, I want to say, the last one that was very, very effective. But not so it was I forget the name. Yeah. I do think it was effective, but it goes to my point of how the actual elites, right, who are already in that space, co-opt these movements, co-opt these models of organizing through whether it be sheer power, finesse, money, access, resources, because a lot of what happens is, and you see it, for example, even when we talk about, the LGBTQ and DEI. A lot of people who organized around DEI, and people have heard me critique it, but what I will say is that where the misstep usually happens is that they align themselves with the elites, right? Who are the conservatives, the private companies, institutions that have already seized power, arms, and ranks within our government are able to say, you know what? I'm going to thwart movements based on co-opting them through corporatization, privatization. So you had a lot of corporate interests in these movements as a way to undermine them. And to your point that you were getting to is that you have the service class who are elites in their own right or aspiring elites in their own right, trying to usurp the elites. And this is where, again, for me, you get people like Bernie Sanders, the Donna Brazils, just that counter elite class, right? So you got elites and then you got that counter elite, which kind of is the class that creates these bubbles where we get these subcultures of, example being DEI, that go against what is culturally the norm. And what happens is that group, and you could tell me how you feel or what you think about it after this, that group, if successful, usually tends to find themselves doing the very thing that they fought to undermine. So Mamdani is going to fight for the people, quote unquote, but then ultimately do exactly what it was that he was fighting against. Barack Obama is another good use case for that. I don't think he ever had the intention to, but people thought that he was. So I think that is a good use case in the sense that he was hope. Everybody thought that he was going to be the person who was going to undermine the quote unquote status quo. And he furthered it, entrenched it, and in a lot of ways solidified it. And became the very thing that he was sent in to do.
And
yes, they did. And I think it's important to note, because a lot of people don't, I think people know it, but I don't think they understand the context of it. Because again, enslaved people choosing British freedom, like the indigenous nations were crushed. The ones that were here to, again, bring in and usher in what would be the Atlantic slave trade. And then you had the liberty, to your point, that only applied to the white male property owners and those who had power, and then those who were right under them who are also trying to get their own power. But what a lot of people fail to realize in that, and I know people hate when I say it, is slavery, they didn't want to not let it go, not because of hatred. Like, and I know people want to believe that it's out of hate, but I think that understanding that it was the greatest money move, that it was one of the greatest business moves, that it was one of the greatest thiefdoms, and being able to extract something for nothing to produce a gargantuan ecosystem that I think people have to put into context. America would not be America at such a young age if not for the thiefdom that happened. And I also think that, again, when you remove it from the context of hatred, it makes it easier to understand why we're moving so fast towards AI. Because it's not really about whether you hate it or not. It's about the optimization and being able to extract almost something for nothing, because we live in this highly transactional society, and a lot of it stemmed from the perversions that took place at that fundamental point. And I would say a lot of everything is kind of baked into that. And I know a lot of people don't want to believe and acknowledge that we still have structural racism within our country. But I think a lot of the things that come out of the wash as it relates to how our economy works and how a lot of different things find themselves placed are in some ways a result of that. Because I won't go as far as say that everything, but in some ways it is a result of that. Like I said, in my video about like Donald Trump, him with the 50-year mortgages not necessarily being anything new. It's a continuation of how people have chosen to handle certain issues and how people have chosen to mitigate certain issues. And instead of actually addressing the structural issues, we choose to say, all right, cool. We just gonna make it available for you to be able to rent a house for the rest of your life, because that's essentially what it is. And I think the same thing has happened with labor in America, because again, slavery is slavery. The atrocity is the atrocity, but it forms the relationship of how labor is interpreted and viewed and therefore used throughout the course and history of America. Because essentially when you talk about that class warfare, that's the biggest struggle. That's where a lot of the debt comes in, because people are not being able to capitalize on their labor in the way that they should based on the output. And that's where we, even as a nation, have these huge gaps in deficits, or not deficits, but the debt is that lack of meeting the moment of productivity with said projections on the future. Because people are productive, but the problem is that the said projections on the future are too big. But when you had slavery, there was no gap. There was just productivity. And I could do whatever I want to make more of those things, because the productivity is coming from an actual good in itself. Like a slave was a good. So there was no gaps. It was just goods making goods, making goods, making goods, making goods. And that also in itself was a level of destruction to our ecosystem, but it didn't, and it's not showing itself until now, because we haven't addressed that gap in between those two. But I think you're spot on in terms of that, because nobody has really paid for it. And I want to move that to the founding fathers, right? And because we rehumanize these people all of the time, which I'm not totally against, because they are men. They are men of their time. They are gross. They are disgusting. We can have those conversations. But I think it is important to kind of parse out power ethics and the contradictions of how we find ourselves here, because I think we see that today in our political landscape, whether you're on the right or the left. For example, Marjorie Greene Taylor just vacated her seat because I guess Donald Trump didn't necessarily want to support her run for Senate. And I'm not even going to speak or speculate on all of the backdoor stuff that I know that happens with people that leads up to decisions like that. But then you see it also within how contradictory our corporate space is, as well as the democratic space, and how people profess certain values, but very rarely do we see people walk in those values. Because for me, I hear people say all of the time, you know, what should and what needs to be done. But on the flip side of that, I hear people say, let's double down on the behaviors or the debauchery that perpetuates the outcomes that we're already living in. So you got a Jasmine Crockett who's like, oh yeah, Donald Trump is trash, garbage. All of those values are out of control. But you're going to mirror and adopt him carbon copy. Not take what works, but you're going to try to out Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And what do you think about the contradictions that we see? And can a nation be morally great if it was strategically dishonest at birth? So, do you think that that is a response to the cloud that looms over the founder specifically, or do you think as a result of the things that they've done, that cloud or that mechanic, for lack of a better word, is something that will continue to loom and re-perpetuate itself?
So,
Yep. And to your point, I think it's a class revolt dressed as universal liberty, a racially exclusive freedom project, and the Civil War is masked as a clean rebellion. And I think people are trying to replicate that. And I think that is where we will fail if we continue to try to do it that way. Because it must include race. And it can't be just a class revolt dressed as universal liberty. And it can't just be something masked as a clean rebellion. Um, the biggest thing and the biggest takeaway that I took away and that I take away from history is that history is messy. History is about timing, and history, um, and especially America's history, you have to have a love-hate relationship with protest, violence, and power. It is not something that you can denounce in your quest for any of the aforementioned. Liberty does not come without it, especially in a place that was built upon it. So, the founding fathers, this is not a conversation about them being saints or villains. These are men trapped between, the ideals of enlightenment and economic self interest. That is always how I frame it because I think that is the appropriate framing, because I think they would have found or used anybody to do that to, or any group to do that to, which is why they tried to do it to most other groups. It's just that they've made deals, on the back of being in unison or what we call assimilating into whiteness for those groups to not receive the full brunt of what the Negro receives in America. And I think that social contract in itself is the thing that perpetuates and continues to maintain the cloud of America. And so, in a lot of ways, as I always tell people, I'm very enthused that we have Donald Trump. I'm very, you know, it is unfortunate that we have Donald Trump. But I think in that there is nuance that can be had that he is, like many others, who I will not name, are necessary evils to get us to where we need to be, to make us and force us have certain conversations that we aren't usually willing to have in and when things and times are comfortable. So thank you, bro. I appreciate you for coming.
appreciate you, my
As always, it's a pleasure, and we're gonna do this some more. I appreciate it, and you enjoy. Yep.
you too.